So welcome everybody to this session on democratization, conflict, and post-conflict processes. We have three very interesting and interrelated papers. It could not have been better organized, I can tell you. We have a paper that looks at the impact of the Maoist insurgency on health, children's health in Nepal. And we have a paper that looks at the spread and onset and spread of conflict itself. And we have a paper on the post-conflict peace process. Outstanding panel. So welcome everybody. Just general rules. So we have three presentations. I ask that we take no more than 12, roughly 15 minutes, leave some time for Q&A and discussion at the end. Mute your mic and video if you're not presenting, unless you're presenting. And we'll go in the order it is listed on the program, with Khusiman and Kira going first, followed by Nishant and Varsha at the end. So with that, Khusiman, the floor is yours. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Hi, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yep.
Okay, let me minimize this. Okay. Hi, I am Khusiman Poon. I am doing my PhD in University of New Mexico. I'm PhD candidate at the moment, and I'm studying economics department. So this paper is work in progress, and your feedback will be like really helpful to make this paper better. So the topic of my work is like a decade-long Maoist insurgency and the loss of child health in Nepal. This is the combined work of me and Dr. Kira Vilas, is my supervisor. So the background is like Nepal faced the armed conflict that started on February 30, 1996 between Communist Party of Nepal and the government of Nepal. And the insurgency has taken like 13,236 deaths and 1,006 disappearances and 785 disabilities. And the war ended on November 21, 2006 with the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Accord. And the war was like almost for 10 years, and it's pretty long time, and it has got a lot of toll and to the Nepalese people. So my basic research question in this work is, did the Maoist insurgency affected the nutritional status of the children? And the second question is like, how was the effect across the economic classes? Because the war is related to the communist insurgency, so I definitely felt like how the war affected the different economic classes groups in Nepal. And the third question is like, how was the effect across the caste and ethnicities? So the Maoist insurgency in a way is linked with the economic class struggle, and also with the identity issues and other like Dalit issues or like gender issues. Like Nepal had this historical marginalization issues, and that definitely had caused insurgency. And that's why like I was interested to look the effect of the insurgency across the caste and ethnicities. So the motivation behind this work is like, as per the report of 2006 Nepal Demographic Health Survey, it has found that 36% of the children under age were stunted, and this definitely is the national issues of Nepal. And why malnutrition? Because for any development countries, for the human capital formation, the health of the child is really important, because malnutrition in the early time of the children is like related to the cognitive outcome that was present even in the preschool time. And in the long run, the effect of the malnutrition was like the result of this shorter adult height, less schooling, reduced economic poverty, and in case of women, that could lead to the lower offspring birth weight, and this could even go for the intergenerational transmission of the effect. And overall, in the world, like 400 million children still live in the countries who is affected by the violent crime. And I believe that this work could be useful for larger context also. So the data for my work, I got the killing data from Information Sector Service Center. That is, this is a non-profit organization NGO, and then it is based in Kathmandu. For the child health variables, I have used a Nepal Demographic Health Survey for survey datasets from year around 1996 and 2006. And this dataset has because this the insurgency exactly happened in between this 1996 and 2006. So this data set is really useful to see the impact of the insurgency. So my basic summary statistic is so I am looking at HAZ. It's my dependent variable. HAZ refers to height of the children, age of the children, and it also takes consideration of the sex of the children. And because any shock in the child is reflected in height rather than the weight, if there is continuous shock experienced by the children, then it is more reflected in the height of the children. That's why I have considered HAZ as a dependent variable. So from this summary statistic, we can see that before the war, you can see the difference is not statistically significant between the low conflict area and the high conflict area. Whereas after the insurgency, you can see the difference is statistically significant, and this difference has increased compared to the pre-insurgency time. And this shows that the difference is not in favor to the high conflict areas, the children belonging to the high conflict area. So some other variables, these are the mechanism variables. I have taken consideration a number of antenatal service taken by the pregnant woman and the number of tetanus vaccine. And in terms of for child, we can see the vaccine taken by the child, the prevalence of diarrhea. All these variable I have considered for the analyzing the mechanism. And this mechanism variable shows that before the war, the difference of these variables is not in favor to high conflict region. And this was that in my analysis, there is some conscience of endogeneity, that maybe the children in the high conflict area have some unobservable characteristic or some socioeconomic variables, which is not in favor to the high conflict area children. That's why this summary statistics gives me an issue of endogeneity, which I'm going to address in my analysis. So this is the box plot of HAZ, my dependent variable. So before the war, you can see that there is not much difference, in the HAZ, but after the war, you can see that there is a slight, little bit lesser nutritional status of the children in the high conflict region. So I have plotted, so in my independent variable, this is HAZ, and in x-axis, this is the killed per 1,000 population. And from this table, I get the 2 points from this table, so diagram, that before the insurgency, we see a linear fitted line here. And this shows that before the war, there is some relation of killed per 1,000 population and HAZ. And this definitely raised the issue of endogeneity. And after the insurgency, you can see that the fitted line is more stiffer compared to this one. And this definitely shows some effect of the war on nutritional status of the children. So this is my econometric model where my dependent variable is HAZ, and this is a definitive model. So the variable or the coefficient that I'm interested in is B3. That is the interaction of post variable and killed per 1,000 population. So I have used some other control variables like household age, household head sex, age, caste, ethnicity, and residence. And I have used the birth year fixed effect and birth month fixed effect of the children and the development region and the ecological belt. So for the identification strategy, this map shows the intensity of the Maoist insurgency in the different regions. I would love to use a district as a unit, but in 1996, I don't have district information. That's why I had to create these sub-regions, and I have used the development regions and the ecological belt, and 5 development regions and the 3 ecological belt. That's for 15 sub-regions, and then so all these regions are I have 15 units, and so here I have this star this represents the Rolpa district. And I have used distance of Rolpa district with the center of other units as the instrument variable. And as I said, like I have the 15 sub-regions, and I have plotted like how the distance from the Rolpa district with other sub-regions and how it is linked to the killing per 1,000 population. It somehow shows that there is the linear relation. And I think that this somehow shows that it's okay to use this as an instrument variable. And this is the first stage result of my instrument variable. And I have used distance to Rolpa 1 and then square of distance to Rolpa. And the result shows that as the distance from the Rolpa increases, then there is a decline in the killing per 1,000 population. And the decrease is in the increasing rate when you interpret the coefficient of square of distance to Rolpa. And my F value is like 725, and Mrs. Fairley says like it's good to use this as an instrument. So this is my main results, and the first column shows the OLS results. This shows that there, because of the killing, each unit increase in the killing per 1,000 is resulting into like minus 0.107 decrease in the child health. But as I use the IV, then my coefficient has increased to 0.256, like, which is like kind of significant. Like the magnitude is strong because for the children because the children in Nepal is already very vulnerable, and most of the children are stunted, and this coefficient means that the insurgency has definitely caused a lot effect on the nutritional status of the children. So in heterogeneity analysis, I have seen that the effect of the insurgency on different subsamples.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You have about 2 minutes to wrap it up, please.
Okay, sure. Yeah, this result shows that like as the wealth index increases, the effect on the children is like is also increases. This shows that the dynamics of the class struggle was really actually happening in the insurgency time. And in the effect across the caste and ethnicity, I can see like in Janajatis, there was like very huge magnitude of like change in negative effect on the health of the children in the Janajati community. Maybe this result is suggesting that, yeah, there were some issues among the Janajatis, like because of which like we have this huge effect. Like I'm surprised that Dalit doesn't have the significant effect. But yeah, this table shows that a lot of people from the children from the Janajatis were suffered. So the conclusion is like Maoist insurgency definitely has caused negative effect on the HJ of the children, and the effect across the wealth index, like the rich household have suffered the most, and among the indigenous people children, like they have suffered a significant loss. Thank you. And
very much, Khusimanji, right on time. Absolutely appreciate it. Let's move on to the next presentation by Nishant. It's on state capacity and armed civil conflict, evidence from a decade-long civil war in Nepal. Nishant, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adhikari. This is wonderful. Thanks for the introduction. Happy to be here. Thanks to the organizers for putting this space for us to sort of present some of our work. I've already had a chance to meet one of my colleagues after a decade, so that's already a win-win for me. Thanks to everyone for being here on the Sunday evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Must be a big opportunity cost of being here, so thanks a lot. What I'm going to do, let's talk about what I'm not going to do. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to collect new data. I'm going to use the same insect data that Khusiman just outlined, and I'm going to use data from prior. I'm not going to have findings that will surprise you. These findings have already been discussed by people who are part of the conference here and others. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the conflict from sort of a different angle, or a different prism, if you will. And the prism will be the institutions and the development of state idea. So let me just try and go forward. I'm assuming that you can see my screen. Okay. So what I'm going to start with is this general idea that I've borrowed from Tim Beasley. And the idea is that institutions are at the foundation of state. Institutions being formal rules and regulations or some norms, values, beliefs, culture, and so forth, right? They help build common interests in society, help build the state capacities, and in turn that leads to peace and prosperity, stability, and so on and so forth, okay? Also, what is important in his framework, he calls it the virtuous cycle of development, and there's this constant sort of feedback that's going into the institutions, improving the institutions, okay? If I were to map that into the Nepali context, we did have some sort of peace and stability, perhaps not prosperity, but certainly peace. And then that goes back to sort of how the state was founded and institutions inherent in the beginning of the state, right? And that all goes back to sort of the Shah dynasty and embodied in the monarch itself. With regards to state capacity, there can be many capacities, such as fiscal or military. I'll argue that we didn't, or rather, Nepal didn't have much fiscal or military capacities compared to some other countries, for instance. But we did have some legitimate capacity, which basically is things like ideas and symbols and things like of that sort to unify the country in essence, okay, and create more stability. I'll argue that the massacre sort of depleted these capacities directly, and then because of the depletion, it created a space for instability. Okay? And that brings me to sort of these two broad questions. The questions are basically, did the depletion of the capacity, especially legitimacy, increase conflict, armed conflict? And if it did, can we link that back to some of the motives? And here I'll discuss the inequality in land. Okay. What I'm going to do for the presentation is I'm going to be very broad. I'm going to refer you to the paper, which I can share after the presentation. But I'm going to give you a broad overview and then discuss some of the findings. I'm going to skip through some of the earlier slides. I think Khusiman also just talked about the conflict itself, and I'm assuming that you all know that, and in the interest of time. So two things that concern me as soon as I put out those questions, right? First is, why is 2001 important? We had a decade-long war from 96 to 2006. Why would 2001 be important? And to answer that, I'll just put up two charts. First of all, this chart showing the spatial distribution of conflict. The one on top shows you the pre-massacre conflict, and the one on the bottom shows you the post-massacre conflict. And the darkness of the color basically tells you how intense the conflict was in each district. And you note that in the pre-massacre conflict, it was basically limited to a few districts, a handful of districts, really. In the post-massacre, the conflict spread to all parts of the country, one, right? Secondly, you can also look at the temporal distribution of conflict. By that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the 11 years of conflict into 22 periods, broadly 6 months each. And in each 6 months, I'm going to calculate the number of districts affected by conflict. And how I've defined the number of districts affected is if a district had more than 5 deaths in that 6-month interval, you can slice that up different ways and you get to similar results. I've also done that in the paper. So what we see here is that, for instance, right before the massacre, and you'll see a lot of lines in my map, in my charts at the middle, which basically signify the massacre, okay? So what you'll see here is that there are 11 districts that are affected by this definition by conflict in the 6 months right before the massacre. And then in the 3 years or so, that number was fairly stable, right? Right after the massacre, there's a big explosion, at least a 3-fold explosion. And if there were no sort of ceasefires during these periods, it would probably be higher. Okay, so I'll argue in that sense, 2001 is very important, and when we look at this. The second thing that comes to mind that concerns me is that, well, if 2001 was important, are there other things that's happening in 2001 that's driving these results and not the massacre itself? And to argue against that, what I'm going to do is provide some evidence towards that. Okay. First of all, let's look at the election results in the 1990s. There were 3 elections in the 90s. The last one happened in 1999, which is well into the period of the conflict, the civil war. Okay, and 2 things that I'll highlight. One is that the two main parties were winning almost all the seats, more than, at least the majority of the seats, more than 80%, 90%, close to 90% in 1999. The other important thing is that the participation had not changed, or rather participation had not decreased. It had been slowly increasing throughout the decade, right? So looking through that lens, there's no sort of foretelling about the explosion on conflict. The second thing I'll look at is some economic indicators, just to give you an idea of what if there was a change in sort of the military or fiscal capacity. Here, the military expenditure doesn't change. The GDP is hovering around 5%, which is pretty healthy. There's no shortfall in tax revenue. There's no shortfall in development aid, and so on and so forth, right before that line that signifies the massacre. Okay, so there's no change there predicting or foretelling any of the explosion in conflict. The third thing I'll look at is from a democratic point of view, the democracy angle, right? So what I'm plotting here is a policy score, which basically captures how democratic a state is. It is an index that gives you a score for a country that scales from -10 to 10. If you're 6 and above, it's a democratic state. Okay, and in this, this is the map for Nepal. This is the sort of the trend for Nepal. And if you look at it, by the right before the massacre, Nepal was flirting with democracy. So it was in all aspects a democratic state. And that also does not give you any reason why the conflict would explode. And you can look at other indicators here. I'm looking at the world government indicators that will also give you similar ideas. Okay, I'm going to skip the details there. So given that, what we have is this exogenous shock in 2001 that what I'm arguing is change the nature of conflict. Okay, and if it did, then, and it did lower the state capacity, then we should see increased conflict in the aftermath. And that's
3 more minutes.
Okay,
we have
perfect. Thank you.
3 more minutes.
Perfect. Thanks. So to do that, what I'll do is I'll take a similar conflict in India, which was by the Naxalites, and I'll do a different study using the Naxalite conflict as a counterfactual. Okay, and in particular, I'm just going to breeze over that. What we will see, what we expect to see, if there was no shock in Nepal, the solid line is Nepal, and the dotted line, the dashed line, is the Indian conflict. What we would see without the massacre is probably a parallel trend with the two curves, right? Instead, we see this increase in the Nepali case, and that increase, if you do the regressions, and there are a few of them here, more in the paper, but what I find is a 6-fold increase in that. Okay, I'm going to skip through just some of that to go to more of the distribution aspect. And in distribution, the literature is mixed broadly, in general broadly, and then also in Nepal, there's mixed results coming from the literature that inequality was important. What I'll use is sort of, I'm just going to skip through most of this, and then sort of the same idea. There are other specifications that I've done in the paper, but just to be consistent with the different specification earlier, I'll just divide the groups into high inequality and low inequality, and use the 2001 shock as sort of the identifier there. Okay, and see what the difference is in between high and low. Let's just talk about the median dividing the high and low groups. And there, what I find is that if we do the different regression with high and low groups using the massacre as an identification, then we find a 3-fold increase in total number of deaths. And there's also some increase in the number of conflict. I'll skip through some of the results there. So just to give you an idea, there's a 3-fold increase in the total number of deaths. If you use deaths and injuries and disappearances and so on, there'll be a little bit under 3. The total number of days of conflict was around 2, but not very significantly different from no change. This is using Gini index as the dividing factor, right? The other important thing is obviously income level, and income level plays a role in conflict. Generally, people have argued that low-income countries have a lot more conflict, civil conflict, right? So what I do is I look at the income level of each district and divide the groups and do the same study, and I find no effect. So just to conclude, I think looking at the institutional framework and gives you an idea of what the opportunities and motives are for conflict. And using that, I find a 6-fold increase in conflict in the aftermath of the massacre in Nepal, and 2 to 3-fold increase in higher inequality districts than compared to lower inequality districts. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Nishant. My apology for rushing you through, but this is a really interesting paper. I'm sure we'll have time to come back to it during the Q&A. Let's move on to the final presentation by Varsha on gender inequality and agency, the women's narratives on claiming justice.
Thank you, Prakash, and very, very interesting and insightful presentations by my previous panelists. Namaste and hello, everyone. My name is Varsha, and I am an early career researcher, and I recently completed my doctoral degree from the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University here in the UK. The title of my presentation today is Gender Inequality and Agency, the Women's Narratives on Claiming Justice. So in my presentation, I'll be talking about the complexities around the conception of agency in both theory and practice, briefly presenting on how it is constructed within the global transitional justice and the human rights scholarships, and what are the real narratives of agency from the conflict victims, particularly women in Nepal, which is where I'll touch upon the disconnect between the two. My presentation is based on my PhD thesis and fieldwork in Nepal, which I conducted in 2017 and 18, where I interviewed a range of conflict victims from Bordia and Makwanpur districts, who were primarily women, including those whose family members were abducted, disappeared, or killed, those who were physically disabled, injured, or physically tortured, and those who suffered rape and sexual violence during the conflict. Now let's look at how agency as a concept, it's constructed within the justice and the human rights framework. So it's a concept that has been defined and interpreted in various disciplines, as we know, by social theorists, feminists, anthropologists, human rights, and post-colonial scholars, broadly as a set of actions, whether individual or collective, taken by people to confront historical oppression, patriarchy, deprivation, discrimination, inequality, and in my particular case, legacies of human rights violations. Amartya Sen has measured agency as a process where the people have to be seen as being actively involved, given the opportunity in shaping their own destiny. However, within the broader transitional justice narratives, the notion of agency continues to remain top-down and prescriptive, and usually understood from the rights-centric lens. There has also been an assumption that the concept of victims exercising agency is directly proportional to how punitively the perpetrator can be treated within the criminal justice system. Agency has almost always been seen as a response to claim justice for conflict-related human rights violation, and not necessarily for any historical marginalization that the victims may have endured. People are encouraged to exercise agency in a more individualized way than in a collective way, and by participating in formal systems and enabling activism in a more more political processes rather than social cultural processes. What is not fully appreciated is the capacity of people to exercise agency within their everyday living, the ordinary but the embedded resistance in the interaction within their own society, in the neighborhood, as well as in their interaction with the state and the authorities. There is this articulation of victim as a weak, passive, and helpless individuals, portray victims as people without agency, where victims are reduced to this apolitical person in need of rescue rather than political beings capable of analyzing and responding to their own sufferings. The creation of these neat binary identities of individuals as either victims or perpetrators has often obscured the complexity of how victims deal with and resist harm, loss, or any painful experiences in their lives. What has been perhaps most worrying is that transitional justice and human rights community has they've legitimized their existence by representing the victims, and in doing so, they've robbed victims their agency, which is very important for victims' empowerment and their citizenship. Now let's look at how agency is seen in the everyday lens by the victims, particularly women in Nepal. During my field work in Bordia and Makwanpur and in my interviews with the research participants, I found that despite the structural constraints of poverty and marginalization, many women took very proactive action in reshaping their lives and relationship after their experiences of war. They reflected on their agency from everyday living and recognized the power and responsibilities they have to make their own decisions and take actions to personally and socially transform their lives. The way they did that was by working with their own understanding of agency within their small local constructs and articulating the conditions that enabled or inhibited their efforts. Many women, for example, who'd lost their husbands in the war spoke about personal transformation when they assumed greater responsibility within their households, when they became the key decision makers in their families, and they acquired more mobility, resources, and opportunities for participation in public sphere, public life. Agency also gave a platform for women to challenge the status quo and discriminatory norms that are usually practiced in traditional patriarchal societies like Nepal, and which can restrict them spaces for recognition and representation. A primary example of social transformation was when many women whose husbands were disappeared during the conflict in Bordia rejected widowhood and continued to wear their symbols of marriage. By going against the traditionalist Hindu patriarchal practices, these women not only opposed the discriminatory norms against them, but also sought acceptance from society for their newfound identity. Their agency and activism at a broader level helped these women reestablish their acceptance within their society as respected community members, particularly when they could see themselves as people who could speak and advocate against a range of social injustices and discrimination. This was truly transformative for them, where they could see the possibility of social change through addressing the norms and attitudes that had once contributed towards their experiences of victimhood. These women also benefited from being able to exercise agency through their collective identity, where they found strength by working with each other in ways that deepened their sense of self-worth and confidence. In the research, it appeared as if for many women, their shared experiences of violence and marginalization and its pervasiveness in their daily lives acted as an impetus for them to come together and work collectively to effect change. What was truly transformative for them was this feeling of belonging and solidarity, something that the violence, poverty, and historical marginalization had eroded for many. For example, being associated with groups like Cooperative or Local Victims Group in Bordia, many women I interviewed found an avenue to discuss and reflect on what was truly important for them, their needs, their expectations, their family priorities in life. These sort of platforms helped them to confront their personal and social barriers and find opportunities of new learning, which in itself, I think, are necessary steps towards action and agency. The solidarity amongst these victims also enabled them to challenge the exclusionary norms and push their collective agendas to seek social justice. But these routes for agency for most women were not really a prescribed path. Rather, it was more of a disjointed and incoherent journey because their everyday life and relations were as complex as the underlying socioeconomic and political dynamics that influenced them. In practice, the same experiences and conditions that sort of influenced their victimhood also hindered their sense of agency. And therefore, it was this complexity that made sustaining their agency even more difficult. My research observed that even in situations where women had to build resilience and courage to take a stand against the injustices they'd experienced, the agency was stolen and politicized at the top, from the center in Kathmandu by the state, political actors, human rights activists, and the broader transitional justice community. The latter often appropriated their agendas for their political goals or institutional interest. But more importantly, the unequal power relation between the two became the basis for effective means of control and to legitimize exclusion for these marginalized women. For these women, therefore, agency became this constant push and pull, where they were in a relentless negotiation with others to have control over their own agendas. And the experiences of historical inequality made such efforts even more difficult to achieve. While some managed to push...
Varsaji, 2 more minutes, please.
Sure. While some managed to push the boundaries and exercise proactive agency despite the limitations, others were only able to apply very limited agency. Just to conclude, I would like to make an argument that agency for people living in very unequal post-conflict societies, particularly for women in Nepal, is a much more wide-ranging and complex concept, where their own forms of expressions, behaviors, and actions can help create opportunities for constructive change, even amidst the constraint of deep-seated structural hindrances. Agency is a route for positive social transformation, providing them not just the means to make broader claims of legal justice and political change, but also to demand respect and acceptance denied both as citizens and victims of long-standing marginalization. These forms of agencies are usually seen, like I mentioned before, in their everyday resistance, where people act in their everyday lives in ways that could undermine power. More importantly, such actions derive from within their own culture and local context, and from within their everyday spaces can offer more valid and authentic ways of agency. Just to end the research, my research makes this critical argument that when discussing agency, what needs to be explicitly recognized is the deep-rooted attitudes and norms that perpetuate poverty, inequality, and discrimination that can limit one's agency, because they are beyond the control of people, even though it may have major impact in their action and activism. Therefore, when framing the notion of agency, the diversity of people's roles and identity, individually or collectively, within their particular construct needs to be taken into consideration. The transitional justice and the human rights mainstream discourse must therefore challenge its own predisposition if it wants to develop a more nuanced and expansive concept of agency that places greater emphasis on the complex and these diverse form of agencies that victims exercise in post-conflict societies like Nepal. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Varsaji. Okay, wonderful. This leaves us with about 13 minutes for Q&A. And I see that there are already some really interesting questions. So let me, as you can see on the chat box already, let's start with questions for Khusiman here. I guess the first question here is, were there any other instruments that you consider from Siobhan? And then we have a question from Soumyajit. Could you please elaborate on the class, caste, dimensions of the insurgency, blah, 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 like which groups were the most affected? What about the short-run impacts? I mean, you can read the questions here. So Khusimanji, you can respond to them quickly.
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. I want to go with the first question that have you considered any other IV? Yeah, I when I first started, I was thinking about the forest coverage because the war is more related to the forest, right? But again, like the child health is also related to the forest thing. Like I was finding some relation of forest coverage and child health. That's why I couldn't use the forest. Similar with the elevation, like most of the war happened in the hill area, right? The elevation matters, but again, the elevation is related with the high nutritional status of the children. That's why I couldn't use that, and that's why the distance to Rolpa. So Rolpa is the epicenter of the war, and then like from distance to the Rolpa could be a better instrument. That's why I use that. Yeah, I did consider other, but I didn't find that useful other instrument. But yeah, I think if I can get more instrument, then that would be really great to use. And the second question with Soumyajit, like, yeah, about the result that I got was like the poor were not affected much and the rich were affected, right? And I think like the reason behind that was like because the child of the poor families is already so low that the effect could not be like more severe effect could not be there. But whereas like in the insurgency time, the rich households' land were captured, and like the money were like asked from the guerrillas to the rich families, and like perhaps because of all those things, because the rich households were targeted from the insurgents, that actually might have resulted in the decrease in the nutritional status of the children of the rich household. That is the thing with the class struggle. And another thing with the identity, like with the Janajatis or the caste ethnicities, I want to mention this story here, that the sociologist from Nepal, Chaitanya Mishra, he has mentioned that in the beginning, in the beginning of the Maoist insurgency, they raised the issue of the class struggle, but they were not able to recruit more insurgents. And then later they started saying that, okay, yeah, you guys are marginalized more, so historically marginalized. I will address your identity issues, and I will give you autonomy to your regions, and all these things like attracted the Janajatis, the indigenous groups. And possibly because of more Janajatis in the insurgency, that could result in significant negative loss in among the household of Janajatis. So I think somehow I addressed the questions. If there is more questions, then please let me know. I got one.
I'm muted. Thanks, Khusimanji. Let's move on to the next one. Nishant, we have a question for you here from Vinish, and I'm going to add a point to that so you can read the question. Can massacre itself be driven by unobserved forces that determines the conflict? So in other words, if there is an exogenous factor at work here, and I think Vinish is pointing towards some sort of an endogeneity here, if there's a way for you to tackle that. But and I wanted to push you back a little bit on the massacre that you pointed out as an exogenous factor, something we looked at, and maybe other way to look at this is if you look at Tero and Sydney Tero and others' work, like they bring in this tipping point, the social movement literature. So I wonder though if the massacre, as opposed to, like you said, providing an exogenous shock that shocked the system, it provided an opportunity, sort of a political opening for the insurgents to regroup or better group themselves, like Khusimanji was alluding to us in a minute ago, right? And so if you can speak to that, so maybe the first thing, right? So can a massacre itself be driven by something else, an observed factor? And so the second question is, I mean, how do we know the massacre in itself was the deciding factor here, right?
Sure. Thanks a lot for both questions. Very important questions indeed. Before I start, I just wanted to, I think I forgot to thank Dr. Mandy, who's been answering my petty emails over the last week or so. So thank you very much for doing that. Let me start with the first question, which is sort of is the massacre itself endogenous to this, and there it's a very important question, very interesting question, and there's obviously there are a number of hypotheses of the massacre, right? There are a number of competing hypotheses, and the only way to look at this is through, as one historian put it, what is the hypothesis that has the least number of holes, and the official story probably has the least number of holes, that is that it was a family feud rather than any other thing driving, right? But it is something that I cannot really test. The other thing I also want to point out is regarding that, I've been thinking recently, and I've been living here in the US for about 10 years now, and mental health issues, gun-related violence, and events like that are not impossible to having heard so many of those, having lived in the US. So that also sort of provides some more light, I think, into the thinking into that. On the second issue, I'm sorry, can you please briefly repeat that again?
So the question is so if you go back to your theoretical, I'm looking at the framing of your paper here, and then so you anchor it on the on the exogenous shock, the massacre being kind of a tipping point, right? And so I think I'm just suggesting that if you want to bring in the social movement literature, Sidney Terrell and others, they make this argument that provides a tipping point, and so that might just help you better frame your paper. Just a thought, if you not have had a chance to look at it.
Sure, I'll try and look at that. I haven't looked at it, but one of the reasons why I use sort of India as a comparative study is sort of to control for that, you know, and then also just to remind everybody that you know, an insurgency as we had with the Maoists in the early 90s was not something new. We had something like that in the 60s as well. You know, that didn't explode in other terms. And perhaps, you know, if someone would have asked that question in the 90s, we would have probably said it would probably be similar, right? So you know, I'll definitely check out the tipping point literature I just suggested.
Yeah, excellent. And there's just a compliment from Vinish that his entire family watched, I mean, your presentation, listened to your presentation, and they really liked it. So that's just a compliment. Let's move on to, I guess.
I'm really glad. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think there was a question for Varsha about external validity of your finding. Yeah, how can we get a better picture of external validity of your findings? For example, how would you generalize your finding to the rest of the country or cases beyond Nepal, right? Varsha, if you can speak a bit on that. Varsha. Looks like we lost her. She isn't here. No. Dr. Bohara has a question for Nishant, I believe, about inequality is an important factor. You might recollect Dr. Bohara, Mani Nepal, and Dr. Guan, they have a paper on the impact of inequality on the conflict in Nepal.
I totally agree with that statement, and then my results are similar to theirs, so it corroborates their findings as well. So I totally agree.
Yeah, again, so that's the point I was trying to bring into, right? So, and I like that you're frank about your finding. There's nothing new about your finding, which is kind of true. But again, but what do we learn about the conflict, the insurgency in Nepal, right? So your state capacity argument is this, you know, weak state capacity. How do we measure it? GDP, GNP, PPP, Gini coefficient. I mean, do they really measure the thing that we're talking about here, right? So and so we
right.
have this.
If anything,
we get to the same conclusion, right? And so maybe that's what I was trying to suggest you to. Maybe if you want to look at this social movement literature. Of course, you're going to get the same conclusion, yeah.
Yeah, I'll definitely try and do that. But you know, if anything, we're under measuring inequality with some of the mismeasuring or under measuring it, and if that's the case, then we have like sort of the bias going towards zero rather than of the estimates, right? So we're under sort of getting the downward estimate. Yeah, so I'm really interested to if you can forward me some of the important papers there, I'd look into that. Thank you.
Absolutely. We do have literally 1 minute. Thank you everybody for a brilliant presentation, and thanks everyone for your very substantive question. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Adhikari. Thank you, everyone.